And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host, and our guest is Joseph Pearce, popular host here on EWTN in multiple series, talking to him about some of his works. Candles in the Dark, Father Richard Holung and the Missionaries of the Poor. It's an authorized biography, and it's published by St. Benedict Press. We'll also talk about another one of his new works called Beauteous Truth, Faith, Reason, Literature, and Culture, and that's published by St. Augustine Press, I believe, and it's great to have you back.
Good to be back.
Yeah, we had you here a while ago, when you were here talking about The Hobbit, the Bilbo program you were putting together, you know, the one on those two specials, and also on the book and on Shakespeare, and now we're talking about some other literary works. But it's interesting because, you know, obviously you've written on a lot of, literary people over the years. You talk about Shakespeare, Tolkien, Lewis, etc., and other books about great writers who converted over the years. Now you're on Father Richard Holung. Now I'm very happy to call him a good friend of ours here at EWTN. I remember when he first came here, I think it was Father Groeschel brought him. He was on Mother Angelica's show in the late 90s. And since that, we've had a wonderful relationship with him and his Missionaries of the Poor. How did you get hooked up with him?
Well, funnily enough, you know, St. Benedict Press asked me, commissioned me to write the biography, and I must confess I had a great deal of trepidation about it, because as you say, my usual theme is to write about writers, to write about literary figures and dead people who've been dead for a long while.
Right.
You know? And so
is it easier to write about somebody who's not here anymore?
Well, they're not a moving target.
Right, I was wondering. Right.
You know, you can finish the final period at the final sentence is the end of the story. Right. But if you're writing a life of someone that's still living, even when you finish the book, the life goes on. So it's, I wrote a biography of Solzhenitsyn when he was still alive, and I had to do a revised edition with 3 new chapters when he died.
We actually did an interview on that years ago that I don't think we ever aired, or maybe we aired it once a few years ago during the summer.
Maybe need to dust it down.
Dust it down and take a look at it again. I wonder about that. I remember that book. But it's interesting with this too, because you got Father Richard Holung here, and you did this book. And this one's listed as an authorized biography. What does it mean when somebody's an unauthorized biography? People figure you wrote it and they didn't help you or whatever. Authorized biography mean they cooperated, they agreed to do it. How does that work?
Full cooperation, and also they made the archives of the Missionaries of the Poor going right back to before the Missionaries of the Poor, right back to Father Holung's early life as a Jesuit. Mm-hmm. They made all those archives available to me. I went to Jamaica and interviewed Father Holung and most of the other senior brothers, and was given full cooperation throughout the whole process. So yeah, obviously it enriches the book because all this material wouldn't otherwise be available.
Now, because it's authorized, did they have the ability to censor the book in any way, or come back and say, we don't agree with this, we want to change?
No, to my knowledge, nothing at all has been changed in the book as a consequence of anything that's been requested by Father Holung and the Missionaries of the Poor. So no, it's not been censored by them.
Right. So this is how you saw it.
This is exactly how I saw it, but I'm thankful, obviously, to Father Holung and the Missionaries of the Poor for fully cooperating with me with the research.
Right. Now, when you said research, you went there, right?
I did, several times.
And everybody, I think a lot of our audience knows Father Holung. We've done specials, he's done series, he has groups all over the world now, but you focused on his main place, which is in Kingston, Jamaica.
Yeah.
Which is not the, we're not talking about Negril Beach here. We're talking about the real part of the country that the actual people live in. And hopefully we even have some footage we can show while you're talking about your own experiences from one of the documentaries we did a number of years ago. What was it like when you went there?
I mean, I'd never experienced poverty like that ever. It was mind-boggling. Mm-hmm. You see pictures on TV, and none of that really brings it to life until you're actually driving through the ghetto of Kingston, Jamaica. And then you go to their centres, the centres they have for abandoned children, handicapped children, people dying of AIDS, the homeless, the elderly. Mm-hmm. And the extent of the poverty there, and you can't do anything but admire brothers. I mean, this order's very young. Most of the brothers are in their 20s, who basically give up their own lives to minister to the poorest of the poor. And these people are really, really poor. There's nowhere in the United States. I mean, the poor in the United States are Many of the poor in the United States are obese. They have cars. They have, iPods. I mean, that's not the sort of poverty we're talking about when missionaries are poor in Jamaica, in the Philippines, in Africa, in India.
People living on the streets, cardboard houses,
Exactly.
whatever put together by whatever they can find on the street, right?
Yeah, and it's common. It's not the exception. It's the rule in some of these places. It's really eye-opening.
And it's also because it's not like that Jamaica is a heavily Catholic area.
No, emphatically not. In fact, it's a very, very small portion of the population are Catholics. But what a great witness. I mean, see, this is crime infested. I mean, you don't leave. When you go to stay with the brothers in the ghetto in Kingston, you don't go out and search out the nearest restaurant because you wouldn't survive. You'd be killed. But the brothers, wearing their white robes and their blue sashes, can walk with impunity because everybody, including the drug barons, the drug gangs, the gangsters, treat them with respect and with reverence because they've earned it. They've earned it the hard way of 25 years of serving the poorest of the poor in the ghetto, and it's astonishing.
Because they know it's real, and they're living that life. They're not just there for the camera appeal and the walk.
They see it on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
They know that they live a life of poverty in order to serve the poor, and that gains respect even from the most malicious people in society.
Right, and I would think with the populace being supportive of their work, they wouldn't look kindly on them being brutalized, even though we know for a fact a couple of the brothers were killed, right?
Yeah, a few years ago, 2 brothers were shot dead, we think because of drug-related. Father Ho Lung is not also very courageous in the way he speaks out against crime and against violence and against drugs. He won't be... He has a great deal of courage. I mean, he won't be cowed. He's living in the midst of all these gangsters and yet looks them in the eye and tells them they have to stop. And so, on one occasion, two of the brothers were killed, shot by presumably gangsters, but although they were never caught.
But was it clear whether they were the target or they just happened to be?
The gun was fired at the brothers while they were clearing up after breakfast. Those 2 particular brothers were not necessarily tired. They fired the gun in the general melee.
Okay, but it wasn't an intention, obviously,
to
scare or to kill
at
somebody.
very least, it was a warning shot. But obviously, they killed 2 of them. One has to suspect that they meant more than just warning.
Now, obviously, you've got Father Richard, who's got an interesting background. Why don't you talk about it?
Well, yeah, he's an astonishing man. I mean, he's the son of Chinese immigrants to Jamaica. He grew up in poverty himself, and he was brought up as a Buddhist, not as a Christian. But through his experience being brought up by being educated, first of all, at the primary level by Franciscan sisters from New York, so American Franciscan sisters, and then with the Jesuits at high school level, he became a Catholic and eventually went to seminary and became a Jesuit.
Right.
But he was a Jesuit during the 60s and some of the wacky stuff going on then.
Right, you say the swinging 60s.
The swinging 60s.
60s, right.
And he felt called to the poor. So in the end, he gained permission to leave the Jesuits and found the Brothers of the Poor that became known eventually as the Missionaries of the Poor.
Right. It's interesting, too. I always wondered with his background in kind of coming up in the Eastern religion, when so much of kind of what became appealing to groups like the Jesuit was kind of this Eastern mysticism, that maybe he had the ability to see it for what it was when they didn't.
Exactly, and I think he was orthodox, and he could see that what they were teaching was not orthodox. He was an ascetic. He believed in living a life of poverty and chastity and obedience at the time when certain elements, in the Jesuits were preaching disobedience and not the necessity of chastity or poverty. And he was a good, old-fashioned, traditional Catholic at a time when some elements were trying to ditch that sort of Catholicism.
Well, in the chapter you call The Call and the Fall of the Jesuits, you say his resolute refusal to join his fellow seminarians in their quote-unquote liberated and laissez-faire approach to religious life made him very unpopular. Exactly.
He was actually sent to Coventry. He was not spoken to. He was, he was bullied, basically. Bullied. Hopefully they bullied him into submission, but that never happened. He stayed true to an authentic orthodoxy and not the heterodoxy that was rampant at the time.
Right. And in the beginning of chapter 2, which has got the same title, you have a quote here. I love my fellow Jesuits to this day as part of myself, and I pray for the Society of Jesus that it be restored to St. Ignatius's intention that we be the standard of Christ against the prince of this world.
Exactly, and what you have in Father Ho Lung is an otherworldliness, and I think one of the things that he reacted against in the Jesuits in the 60s was a creeping worldliness. You know, the watching TV and wanting comfort and not wanting to actually get their hands dirty with the poor. But he doesn't. I mean, he's very grateful to the Jesuits. He's not against the Jesuits. In fact, his spirituality in some ways is similar to perhaps to Pope Francis. I mean, he has this Jesuit spirituality, Ignatian spirituality, combined with a Franciscan spirituality.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you forget that with the training with the nuns and that he kind of has that.
Exactly, the Franciscan Ignatian mix. It's actually, you know, it's parallels with Pope Francis.
Now you say here in the beginning, you say, although acceptance of suffering is a choice, suffering itself is not.
Yeah, what people forget is you can't avoid the cross. The cross is going to come to you. It's what you do with it once you've got it. You're going to suffer. Suffering is going to come to you in your life. If you resent them, if you allow them to make you bitter and twisted, then the sufferings will actually destroy your life. But if on the other hand you do as Christ asked you to do, is to take up the cross with joy and with acceptance, then Christ helps you carry those crosses.
Well, it's tough to convince people that suffering is not only not a choice, that it is a gift.
Exactly. The
Especially
book actually,
in this world.
Yeah, the book begins, and you know, the opening chapter is called The Acceptance of Suffering. The final chapter is called the Joy of Suffering. And I think that's the real growth in the spiritual life that Father Ho Lung and the Missionaries of the Poor show us, why they are candles in the dark. They show us there's actually joy in suffering. And their motto is joyful service with Christ on the cross. Now, not joyful service of Christ on the cross, joyful service with Christ on the cross. That we embrace our own cross because Christ is on the cross, and we can have joy from that experience.
Right, and that's what many of us who've worked here at EWTN have, and people who watch EWTN have seen that with Mother Angelica.
Absolutely.
That embracing of that suffering and the joy that comes out of that, and that's what she communicates, and that's why she radiates and connects with people. Now, you talk about here one of the most powerful examples. You're talking about souls ennobled and enriched by the experience of acceptance and embrace of suffering. You talk about the two thieves crucified on either side of Christ.
Yeah, I think the scene on Golgotha can be a tableau, if you like, of the whole of human existence. You have at the center the crucified Christ, who dies for us, and they have at either side of him suffering humanity. Those who embrace and accept their sufferings with Christ, and with Christ, are promised by Christ that they will be with him in paradise because of their acceptance of their suffering. Or you have the bad thief on the other side who hates his suffering, who hates Christ, blames Christ for his suffering, and condemns himself to iniquity and to hell ultimately. So I think you can see the whole of humanity basically in that vision we see on Golgotha.
Now, you talk about different people you've written about in the past. And now, there's a Maurice Baring that you talk about and you relate. Now, who is he?
He's a convert, novelist, convert, poet from the early 20th century. Great friend of G.K. Chesterton, great friend of Hilaire Belloc, and actually a very, very underrated novelist. I recommend his novels to anybody.
Now, why do you bring him up? Because you also note, because you start off with a quote from him, but then you mentioned, well, I don't even know if Father Richard Long knows him. So why did you start? You had an extra quote laying around from one of your old books? You decided to use it, or what?
Well, I was struck by the fact that, you know, that when I read that novel by Maurice Baring, that quote by the priest character in it
Is that Darby and Joan?
Darby and Joan is the novel. There's a quote by the priest character there that the acceptance of sorrow is the meaning of life. When you understand that, you'll understand everything. And that had a profound influence upon my own conversion, this understanding of the acceptance of suffering. But I went deeper into my spirituality because of my engagement with Father Ho Lung, and from this, not just acceptance of suffering is not enough. You know, the joy of suffering is what you've got to aim for, and that going even deeper. So I wanted to begin with Maurice Baring's insight that the acceptance of suffering is the meaning of life. Well, no, it isn't. Actually, we go deeper. The joy of suffering is the meaning of life. It's the secret of life. And when you can actually be joyful in life's trials and tribulations, knowing that you're with Christ on the cross, in that, then you really begin to get close to the truth of things. And my engagement with Father Ho Lung and the Missionaries of the Poor and gave me that vision, which I don't think I had as fully before.
Right. Did you also experience just the idea in seeing these people, not only very poor people, but people, very handicapped people, very special needs people, and the love, the way they're treated, and the fact is that in a very real way, it's not just lip service, that the people doing that work get more out of it than the people that they're taking care of, even though that shouldn't be the reason. It's not the reason they're doing it, but it's the net effect.
Yeah, I mean, I experienced this, and everybody that I know that's been to the centres, the Missionaries of the Poor, all come back saying that they feel that they've received more by way of a gift from the poor people they've served there than the poor people themselves receive from them. And I feel absolutely, my life was changed by the experience. I've got visions in my mind and my heart that I can't get rid of and don't want to get rid of a small handicapped girl, for instance, who was paralysed. And I went in, and my initial reaction was almost to sort of shrivel up in horror at the sight of it. And then she looked at me, and she just burst into a really great smile and a giggle, and I just fell in love. My heart melted, and I picked her up, and I felt tears welling in my eyes, and my life was being changed by that girl.
Really? What would you say? You're saying that. What would your wife, maybe, or your kids see in you today? Maybe they don't realize, but what would they be seeing in you that maybe wasn't there before you went?
Well, I think that there's a hardness of the heart which has been softened. There's an understanding of the culture of life on a much deeper level than there was before. I mean, you can theorize about the culture of life. You can know that abortion is killing a baby, but you've got to see, saying that little girl from the ghetto of Kingston would not be alive if it was not for the Missionaries of the Poor. She would have been dumped. She would have been dead. She's her life is, if you like, a gift from God, but also it's a gift for the Missionaries of the Poor, who treat her. They see the face of Jesus in her and are transformed by it. And to see the face of Jesus in suffering humanity, not as an abstract concept, but as an individual person, I think is life changing, and it has changed me, and I know it's changed me for the better.
Based on that, I'm assuming you're not surprised that his order is growing so rapidly and spreading around the world.
Well, I mean, I'm surprised up to a point, because I see there's a miraculous grace here. It's so countercultural. It's so counterintuitive. An order which is basically, it's so tough. You've got to embrace a life of poverty. There's no creature comforts. There's basically no electricity, no TV, none of those sort of things which we take for granted. And the order is growing fast, and it's young men. I mean, the average age is in the 20s, and I find that miraculous. So yeah, I think I am surprised. But what it does show us, of course, and we see it everywhere, that the orders that demand the most sacrifice, that demand that being following Christ, taking up their cross, are the ones that are growing.
Right.
Because grace is poured forth where there's faith, hope, and love, and trust in God. And we see it in Missionaries of the Poor. We see it in various other orders.
Well, are you also surprised by the makeup of who actually joins or where they come from? Because it's not necessarily, at least in the early days, it wasn't a lot of local people who were joining him. It was people from other parts of the world, like India and the Philippines.
Yeah, there's a handful of Jamaicans now, but mostly they're Filipinos, Indians, and Africans. They form up probably 90% of the missionaries are from those areas. But one thing I think is close to home for us, perhaps, is that at least when I was there, there's 600 or so brothers now, and not one of them is a Caucasian. There's no white Americans, no white Europeans. And I think it says something about the culture in which we live, where we become effete, if you like, and we've become so enamored of and perhaps addicted to our creature comforts that we just find it impossible to embrace that life of poverty. So there's something close to home there that perhaps we need to be looking at ourselves. But certainly, to see an order that's growing, and it's young and vibrant and orthodox.
Right. So that is the book, Candles in the Dark, the authorized biography of Father Richard Ho Lung, and of course his Missionaries of the Poor. Now you have a new book called Beauteous Truth, Faith, Reason, Literature, and Culture. Let's talk about it. That's a long title. You try to cover how big is this book?
It's actually a very big book. It's a thick book. It's thicker than probably twice the size of the Father Ho Lung book. Yeah, basically what I wanted to try to do there is to show that goodness, truth, and beauty, the philosophical concepts of goodness, truth, and beauty are a reflection of the Trinity. The Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. That there's a unity in that Trinity, and you can't separate goodness, truth, and beauty from each other any more than you can separate faith or reason from each other. If you separate faith from reason, you get heterodoxy or philosophical nonsense. Similarly, if you try to sort of worship the beautiful without seeing the goodness and truth that's inherent in the beautiful, you actually become ugly, etc. So the whole book looks at the modern culture from various facets, but to show basically that beauty is a manifestation of truth and goodness.
Well, like you said, in the heterodox idea, it's really the exaggeration of one truth to the detriment of another truth that you end up with these problems are. And that's why people say, well, this is so good, we just make this more. This other part we don't like so much. It just doesn't work because it's God's balance.
Exactly,
for us, right?
exactly. Well, Chesterton, of course, famously talking about heresy is taking one aspect of the truth and magnifying it out of proportion to the detriment of others, as you say. So that's the whole point, is to keep this balance. The goodness, truth, and beauty are synonymous. Ultimately, the more you understand them, they're one, like the Trinity. They in some way you might say that they're three, but they're also one. And if you cannot see or understand beauty without seeing and understanding goodness and truth.
And also, what's interesting, because we just finished talking about this book, there's beauty in suffering.
Oh, absolutely.
There's beauty in those who are suffering.
Absolutely,
right?
And that's the whole point. Is that we've talked about in a previous bookmark. We talked about Romeo and Juliet. Is that a happy ending? Well, it might not be a happy ending per se, but it's certainly a good ending. Because if people are behaving in a sinful way, then we want to see the consequences of that sin being negative. People can behave in a sinful way, and like much modern literature and modern TV, and behave sinfully and live happily ever after. Well, that's perverse and also not true to reality, because it's not what happens in life. So the point is that the beautiful depiction of sin is to show its ugliness. There's a paradox.
Right. It's interesting, too, because in Romeo and Juliet, it ends kind of with the all are punished idea.
Right, exactly. Yes.
That whole thing and that there are consequences, which, again, in our society today is something we run away from. We want the ability to have whatever choice we want, but we won't want any of the downside. If that happens, we expect to be rescued or excused.
Right, and also we expect people to turn a blind eye when our own selfishness ruins the lives of others, for instance. We don't want people to bring that up.
Right, and nobody's supposed to say, well, you've made some bad choices here. Well, who are you to judge me? Well,
right. Yeah, right.
Okay, that's how it works. So now you talk about other sections of this book. The first part of the book is called Defining Our Terms. Why is it so important to understand, going into this book, understand how you use these words and these terms?
The point is that many of the things we talk about now, the words have been given to us by the Enlightenment, by basically a post-Christian or even an anti-Christian philosophical consensus. So we have to be able to look at words and say, what does this mean? What is history, for instance? Let's define our terms. What is beauty? What is culture? And if you don't start asking those questions and defining your terms, so this is what we mean by it, then you're talking at cross purposes. I remember an argument I had with my father, about the time I was becoming a Catholic, about pride. And I was saying pride's evil, pride's the father of all sins, and my father was saying, no, pride's good, it's about self-respect and self-dignity. And we came to understand in the end that we're talking about two entirely different things, but using the same word. So, it became clear to me that you have to define your terms. So I begin the book by defining terms. So then when I talk about those things later in the book, people know what we mean by it. And of course, I'm giving, if you like, a Catholic definition of these words, and not an Enlightenment or an agnostic or an atheistic understanding of those words.
Would you be accused of putting a Western definition on it?
Well, I'm putting a Christian definition on it. I mean, I think that the Catholic Church ultimately is universal, and I think, if you like, where it comes from is ultimately accidental. It's not of the essence of the faith. So the Catholic Church is for all men and for all times. So I don't like the East-West dichotomy. So it's a Christian interpretation.
Do you think that's used as a way to kind of put these kind of perspectives down, to say you're being culturally negative or something?
Yeah, well, I think actually there's actually a quasi-racism amongst many modern intellectuals when they scorn dead white European males. Well, someone can't help being dead, someone can't help being white, someone else can't help being European, someone can't help being male. So to hate something for what it can't help being is the same thing as racism. So we have this negativity, and I think we have to put that to one side. That's the whole point about defining terms. That Christianity, I believe, and I make no bones about it, that Christianity is true, that Christ is the Son of God, and therefore our definition should spring from that reality. That's the spring, if you like, from which all other truth comes. So our definition should spring from that. And so I make no bones about it. It's a Christian definition.
Right. Well, let me ask you, where did the idea for this book come from? Was this something that you had inside you wanted to get out? Was this something that your publisher said, hey, I got an idea for a book?
Well, actually, many years ago on Bookmark, I'm sure we did an early book of mine called Literary Giants, Literary Catholics.
Sure, right, definitely.
Basically, that was a collection of previously published essays. This is also a volume of previously published essays. But what I've done, as I did with Literary Giants, Literary Catholics, is I've organised the essays thematically. So there's a coherence and a cohesion. It's not just a scattering of random thoughts. So defining our terms, and then we've got literary landscapes, which is looking at, for instance, Catholic social teaching and literature. So you've got a whole panoramic landscape of what the Catholic Church teaches on social issues, and how this is reflected in Catholic literature throughout the centuries. And then literary portraits, where I look at some of the great writers, the obvious Shakespeare, Tolkien, Lewis, and others.
And what about, where do these essays where do they show up normally when they were originally being promulgated?
Well, many places. Obviously, I'm editor of the St. Austin Review, and many of them are essays published there or editorials published there. But no, I've published in many of the Catholic publications and other publications. Yes, many.
And you're teaching, right?
Yeah,
you're still teaching, right?
I teach at Thomas More College in New Hampshire. Again, much of the fruit of my teaching is to be found in books like this.
So when you're not showing up here or doing series or writing books and teaching, what are you doing with you got a lot of kids there and family and stuff like you're being a good dad though, right?
Absolutely. I want to be at home as much as possible, and that's an important part of my life.
You get to work out of your house, don't you? For the
most of the time, right? when I'm not traveling, when I'm not teaching at Thomas More, which is one week a month, the rest of the time I'm at home writing and editing. So I do get I travel a lot, but I'm also at home a lot. It's a good balance.
And just before we go, another book in the works, I'm assuming.
Well, I'm actually in the middle of writing my own conversion story.
Oh, great.
Which people have asked me to write for years. I'm finally getting around to it.
Make sure you stop by when that comes out.
I'd love to.
Always great to see you. Thank you, Joe.
God
Great. Speaking here with Joseph Pearce about a couple of his works, Candles in the Dark, and this is the authorized biography of our good friend Father Richard Ho Lung and the Missionaries of the Poor. And you also get his new book, Beauteous Truth, Faith, Reason, Literature, and Culture. Both available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. You should check them out. Check us out next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.